Welcome to Winter Fishtrap. Before we get going, I wanted to thank our big funder, which was Oregon Humanities this year, who helped give us a grant in part to support this program. I also want to thank our many sponsors. Hopefully you saw that slide. We are lucky in our community. This year we were sponsored by Alderslope Nursery, Avella Orchard, the Book Loft, everybody's favorite bookstore, Diane Daggett at Ruby Peak Realty, Genuine Wallowa County, the Gold Room, Greater Hells Canyon Council, Ground and Sky Health, Same ET, Terminal Gravity Brewing Company, Wallowa County Grain Growers, and Wallowa Resources. I also wanted to let you know of a couple of things that are coming up. Hopefully you all know this. If you're Summer Fishtrap folks, registration for Summer Fishtrap is kicking off next Tuesday morning at 9 o'clock. It has already garnered lots of attention. So I'm super excited about that. If you want to save your spot for Summer Fishtrap, log on early and get going. And then also on February 16th, we are officially kicking off this year's big read. This year's book is The House on Mango Street. The kickoff this year is an interview that we'll be doing with Sandra Cisneros, the author, and we'll be doing that live, which is both exciting and terrifying. And because we're doing this online again this year, that means no matter where you are, you can join us and participate. So please do pick up a copy of The House on Mango Street from your favorite bookstore or mine, the Book Loft, or at the library, and join us for this year's big read. So the other big thing that's happening is in April, we'll be moving into our new building in the Bowlby building on Main Street. We are really excited about that. We just got word of our first grant for that program with the Eastern Oregon Visitors Association. So yay, literally just got word at 8 o'clock this morning. So that's super exciting. There will be a party, or a partay, as the kids say, on May 19th downtown, and we'll have more information about that very soon. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Fishtrap's favorite program director, Mike Bidlow, as he will kick us off for this program. So sit back and relax. Here we go.
Thanks, Shannon. Appreciate that. Lots of great things happening at Fishtrap. I want to welcome you to the second week of this year's Winter Fishtrap Conference. For some of you, this is your first week, so I just wanted to say that Fishtrap's mission is to promote clear thinking and good writing in and about the West. We've been doing it since 1988. Some of you have been with us since then. And for some of you, this might be your first Fishtrap experience. I just want to welcome you all. Winter Fishtrap is one of the programs that really explores the clear thinking part of Fishtrap's mission. And each year we try to pick a theme that is important to folks in the West to get together, even if you have different points of view, but hopefully spark a new understanding on a theme that's important to us all. And this year is drought. We're trying to look at drought through the lens of the environment, the economy, socioeconomic justice, different cultures, and really the ultimate future of the West. And every day it seems like we're seeing the effects of drought all over the world, and of course, right here at home. How did we get here? Where do we go from here? Last week, Dr. Erica Fleischman, who I see out in the audience today, thanks, welcome back, Erica, the director of Oregon Climate Change Research Institute, talked about the causes and consequences of aridification across the West, and some of the surprising ways in which plants and animals are adapting to these trends. This week, we'll explore how drought is changing the way we think about the future of agriculture, timber, and tourism, and I'm sure a bunch more. You'll hear from some regional and local experts, and you'll have the chance to join in too, folks. We're trying to be as inclusive as we can. We want to hear what you think. Like last week, we encourage you to submit your questions or even comments into the Zoom chat feature, and I'll try to aggregate those. And at the end of the panel discussion, we'll pose those to the panel. Moderating this panel is Katy Nesbitt. I wrangled Katy into doing this. Thank you, Katy. She'll introduce our guests and you'll have the opportunity to. Katy Nesbitt came to Wallowa County in 2008 to run the Minum Motel. Within a few weeks, she started freelance writing for the La Grande Observer and has written for local and regional news sources ever since. In addition to her writing, she is the Wallowa County Natural Resources and Economic Development Director, and she serves on Fishtrap's program committee and a bunch of other things Katy didn't put in her bio, but You get to know her. So I want to now toss the panel discussion for today to Katy Nesbitt. Take it away, Katy.
Good morning. Thanks for joining us on this beautiful day, and we'll get you out of here in time to enjoy some of the sunshine before our snowstorm that's predicted to come in tonight. I want to give a brief introduction of each of the panelists, all good friends of mine who have been also wrangled. I have the privilege of knowing a lot of really smart people since I started reporting and now work at the county. So one of the guys I've known for a good long time is Joseph Goebel. He is a forester and a firefighter, and his longer bio is available, as everyone else's is, on the web, and I'll also let them introduce themselves. But just to hit some highlights, Joseph is down in Wallowa as the interim unit forester with Oregon Department of Forestry, has a lot of experience both with forestry and fire, and worked for the Forest Service for a good long time before going back to ODF. Dan Probert, he and his wife Susie own and run the Lightning Bolt Ranch. He is a Wallowa County native who spent about 30 years over in Malheur County and came back a few years ago. And he's also very involved with Country Natural Beef. I'll let him talk more about that. Hannah Gosnell, I met, I can't remember, sometime in the last 5 years. She's a professor of geography at Oregon State, has been very involved with some programs out of Wallowa Resources, and with another newer friend of mine, Kyle Hogrefe, a candidate in the geography program at Oregon State. And he is now happily living here again. He's part of the Hawkins family in the Lower Valley and is working on forage forecasting and a lot of other cool things that'll help our ranchers in the county. And Joe Dawson is also a local farmer, rancher, and real estate agent. And what I think will be fun in talking with both Joe and Joseph is their sort of the view of how smoke and the real estate market can affect tourism, second home ownership, and this word that we say quietly around here, potential growth, something that makes folks a little bit nervous. And in my world, it's something that we prepare for as much as we prepare for the coming years of drought. If all of you watched last week's presentation, you got some of the hard data. I was in another meeting this past week that was very data driven on what the rest of the century is going to look like. And we really need to conserve our water and our land and our resources to survive in the next 80 years or so. I think I will kick it off with Joseph Goebel. And Joseph, my question for you, after you give yourself a little bit more of an introduction to our attendees today, when I think about what's going to affect us in the future, as far as your world, I think a lot about smoke impacts on locals, on health, and on our tourism. So with that, Joseph, do you give us some thoughts on that and a little bit more background of sort of the forestry and fire realm in Wallowa County?
Yeah, good morning. Thank you, Katy. Like Katy said, I'm Joseph Goebel. I'm currently serving as the interim unit forester there in the Department of Forestry. I also wear several hats in relation to forestry and fire. I manage a fair amount of family timber and grazing ground. So I'm involved in natural resources from that standpoint. I'm also impacted in different ways as a small forestry business owner. So I get kind of multiple views and aspects on a lot of different natural resource topics from that standpoint. I functioned over the years, both kind of as field going forester and field going firefighter, and kind of transitioned into more of the management side of things. So in relation to your question, Katie, as far as kind of, you know, the local impacts that are coming about with smoke management, and just the impacts on smoke, you know, I think there's a number of factors that folks should think about and recognize. I think one thing that our society is grappling with is that for those of us who choose to live in the Pacific Northwest, smoke is going to be a part of our lives one way or another, and there's not really a way around that. I always really like the comment that Dr. Paul Hesburgh, some of you guys may have seen his program. I really think he's got a good perspective in asking people, you know, how do you want your smoke? And that line in and of itself lends us to think about how do we manage our natural resource landscapes to put smoke into our communities in ways that are acceptable and the least intrusive to our health and tourism. And so what I mean by that is we're going to have smoke no matter what we do, whether that's your neighbor burning a backyard debris pile or whether that's a wildfire. And we can do things as a society and a culture to lessen those impacts. And so I think those are really the key takeaways, because we do know that that smoke can have a huge impact on our economy. You know, you mentioned tourism, and personally, I live here because I look at these mountains and that's a beautiful landscape that we have in our backyard. And I haven't found very many places that I would rather live. And people want to come and enjoy that particular piece of our natural resource, right, from the tourism standpoint. And so if we do have these severe wildfires, and they tend to be more severe in drought conditions, that is certainly an impact to our economy. You know, the number of folks that visit our county, I didn't even realize this until this year. I don't know how many folks have a good grasp on how many hundreds of thousands of folks come into the county each year. And that really makes fire and smoke, from the standpoint of economy and health. Fire suppression is not really just a concern of the landowners, it's a concern of all tax-paying Oregonians. And so I think that's the other piece that a lot of our population lately has started to come around to, given the fire events that have occurred the last couple of years. You know, the Eagle Creek fire put a lot of smoke into the Portland area. We had the Labor Day fires all up and down the Cascades. Those are historic events that some folks have not really felt since the Tillamook burn on the west side. And so I think that has really helped to clarify for a lot of our population in Oregon that smoke is really something that we have to deal with. And we're just kind of stepping our foot into the water of how do we deal with that, right? Because there are a lot of different avenues to consider. So I'll leave it there for now, Katie.
I'm going to ask you a follow-up question before moving on to another panelist. How do we prepare our forests to reduce fire severity and maybe even smoke impacts?
Sounds like we need to unmute microphones.
Is Joseph frozen or am I? Joseph's connection might be frozen. We may have to come back to that. Joseph? I'm going to move to Joe Dawson, and hopefully Joseph will unfreeze. He'll thaw. Hey, Danny. Joe Dawson is a farmer and rancher and a real estate agent, which is an interesting combination, but all very much tied to the land and not only its fecundity, but its attractiveness. So Joe is a third generation farmer rancher in Wallowa County and has, well, he's also the vice president of the Wallowa Lake Irrigation District.
Secretary.
Secretary, I'm sorry.
It's all right.
Wallowa County Farm Bureau Vice President. My eyes skipped. So he's involved in a lot of boards. I even have him on Natural Resource Advisory Committee. And Joe, I'm wondering what you think drought, smoke, and some of these other impacts are going to have on our growth and or our second home / tourism industry.
Well, I think the way that drought has really just affected us on the irrigation district is it's kind of put a lot of landowners to try to be as proactive as they can for conservation measures on their farms and ranches. So as far as just trying to preserve that agricultural base, at least with cropland, obviously rangeland is going to be a little bit different, and I'm sure Danny Probert can tell you, but trying to just carve out and protect kind of a piece of ag that can continue to be sustainable in Wallowa County and continue to be a part of this economy is going to be important. And I think water conservation is the biggest tool that we can do. And we've seen a lot of growth over the last 20 years with that, where in particular up in the towards the Wallowa Lake Irrigation District, we've been dealing with a limited storage capacity at the lake, and that's prompted a lot of farmers to kind of upgrade from flood irrigation up to center pivots. We've started looking at more pipelines, and the pipelines have been really kind of fun. They they really started out from funding sources from NRCS, and they started out kind of micro on the farm, and they started getting bigger and bigger and affecting more farms, and it's been kind of snowballing, and a lot more farmers and ranchers are kind of looking at ways to pull it off and to see if we can make bigger projects, because the more that more efficient that we can be, the better we can survive drought conditions. And as far as smoke goes, I think echoing what Joseph was saying, it's something we're just going to have to learn to live with one way or another. I'm definitely not an expert in timber. I'm hoping for the best. And I'm glad that there's people like Joseph Goebel on this that are helping with this, because it's going to be an ongoing challenge for sure.
Thanks, Joe. Water conservation is something that farmers focus on. And I think in another conversation later, it would be good to talk about municipal water conservation. It's something that we're not forced to do here, like some more arid areas of the West, like Front Range of Colorado. But I do think it's something we need to be thinking about when we're watering our lawns, when we're, how are our appliances in the house being water efficient? Because the next few decades, we're really going to have to be tight on water. Kyle Hogrefe has another perspective, and I want you to correct me, you and Hannah. I think the reason we get such bad smoke is the same reason we get this frozen fog in the winter, where we get sucked in. We are geographically inclined to have inversions, and that we often get other people's smoke. People will ask me, where's the fire that's causing all this smoke? And it could be California, Washington, Idaho, Canada. It could be pretty much anywhere. It doesn't have to be a local fire. Now, Kyle Hogrefe is a PhD candidate in the geography program at Oregon State, and has been working on a variety of ways to help ranchers sort of figure out where best to graze their cattle, among other things. And Kyle, I'm wondering if you could tell us, and I know it's sort of a broad question, but how can ranchers who graze do so in such a way to stay in business and yet manage their livestock in such a way that we're expecting drier and drier years?
Great question. Well, for starters, I wouldn't presume to suggest or to tell any rancher how to run their lands. I'm more in the business of presenting information that we hope will be useful for ranchers to make those decisions themselves. What we're coming up with as part of my PhD research is some tools that rely on the analysis of satellite imagery and the use of some computer models to both estimate how much forage is present on the landscape in the current day and up to 3 months out. And then also document using lots of field research in addition to the satellite imagery analysis, what species are present out there across the rangelands. And I would suggest that the way these tools could be used to help ranchers in those aims would be to help to monitor the longer term impacts over broad stretches of land that it might be difficult to keep a mental inventory on. And I'm thinking of some of the multi-tens of 1,000-acre operations out there on the Zumwalt. I also think in the context of, say, the Nature Conservancy's Zumwalt Prairie Preserve, where Mike Hale certainly brings a lot of ranching expertise to some of the management decisions they make out there. But they're keeping track of 30,000 acres with properties coming and going with different ranching histories on them, and these computer-based tools can help in those situations too, just to keep track of what you have and what you're working for. And I guess the way I envision these tools helping with what you're talking about, Katy, as far as managing in a way that lends to resiliency in the face of drought going forward, is in providing these forecasting tools. We hope to make it easier for land managers to manage with the light hand on the landscape. I'm consistently impressed in talking with the ranchers and other natural resource managers across Wallowa County with how much of an eye they actually have to the future, and the wish that they have to have their ranching and livestock management decisions today be beneficial for the future. And I guess that's the way I envision the tools enabling that, is just allowing decision making over vast tracts of land with just some pieces of information that are not available in other ways. I would also point out, in addition to the perhaps direct management of livestock herds for the benefit of future productivity on the land, we also hope that these tools are useful in helping ranchers leverage some of the other tools that are out there, such as drought insurance. I think one of the ways we really stepped forward during this last year's drought, primarily in June, was trying to assess trying to assess the actual impact of what was going on in June compared to the last 5 years. And we started putting out a product, what we're just calling our forage difference product, that shows the surplus or deficit of the current day compared to the last 5-year average. And lots of folks found that pretty useful. For number one, kind of with my first train of thought there, as far as managing the land with a light hand, knowing the exact or pretty precise difference in forage in pounds per acre that was available in June as compared to the last 5-year mean, gave a real solid connection to thinking about how many cattle they had on the landscape for the last 5 years and what that means for this year, just to know that forage number. And a couple of folks have actually used it to better their drought insurance claims, or to better the grip that they have on the actual impact of the drought on the forage they're able to provide to their landscape. Because we have been able to, again, give a figure in pounds per acre of what the drought impact was last summer compared to the last 5 years average. So they were able to, leverage their drought insurance a little bit better by having that information available. I hope that's a reasonable answer to your question there, Katie.
Yeah, thanks, Kyle. And it brings me to Dan Probert, who not only ranches in the county, he also is involved in sort of the bigger picture with Country Natural Beef. And I'm wondering, Dan, how we go into the future with livestock grazing, how extended drought is going to affect that, and how do we become flexible to that so that you all can stay in business?
Sure. So, and maybe to just highlight my history here. So I actually am not a native. I was pretty young when we moved here. Went to high school here and actually graduated right at the height of the farm crisis in the mid 80s. And so along with probably 80% of my classmates, we all left to find gainful employment. And I ranched for 15 years in Central California and then 15 years in Southeast Oregon, and finally cobbled enough equity together to come back and ranch here on the Zumwalt. And one of the tools we used was a conservation easement with the Nature Conservancy. And so it was pretty easy for us to I'll say sell the property rights that the Conservancy was interested in purchasing, which is we didn't want to see wind towers here. We didn't want to see solar farms. We didn't want to see this landscape subdivided. But where we spent a lot of time, almost 3 years with TNC, was coming up with a grazing plan that worked for both them and us. And what we landed on was a system that was based on outcomes. So we left ourselves open to use any tools available to us, but we agreed on outcomes. We agreed on what we wanted riparians to look like. We agreed on what we wanted the uplands to look like. We agreed on, in terms of biodiversity, ground nesting birds and wildlife. And that took us a time to get there. But so as we think about how we manage through drought, the tool that we're using the most is trying to mimic what we think this landscape had in terms of a relationship between grazers and perennial plants here. And the history here would have been predators, pack hunting predators that kept animals condensed in herds and moving. And so our grazing system is set up in that way. We have herds that are fairly high in terms of stock density, but then they stay on a piece of land for a very short time. We're trying to get that down in places even to half days. So, and the idea is, yes, you have a lot of animals there for a short period of time, but then they don't return for, ideally for us, that's at least a year. And so the reason we do that and why we think that's a tool for drought management is we're trying to build soil health and porosity. So by giving the landscape an opportunity to be livestock free for a year, that helps with water infiltration. So there's kind of an old joke or an old saying that someone will ask you how much rain you got. And my answer is we got all of it. But the trick for us is to keep all of it on the land. We want as little as possible to run off. We want it to stay within that soil profile. We want to increase organic matter and soil carbon, which acts like a sponge. So sometimes it's not as important that you got an inch of rain as it is that you're able to keep the inch of rain you got in the soil as long as possible. And that's the tool we use most to manage drought. It just builds resiliency. That one of the largest pressures we're seeing here on the Zumwalt is non-native species, Medusa head, Ventonata, and we think our only viable tool, because we don't think we can spray our way out of it, poison our way out of it, is to make perennial native plants as resilient as possible. And then the other tool that we use, and Kyle mentioned it, the PRF insurance, pasture rangeland forage insurance, which is a private insurance, just like crop insurance, but it is subsidized in terms of the premium, but it's become a large tool for us in terms of managing through the variability of high rainfall and low rainfall years. And I really appreciated what Dr. Fleshman said last week, in that over time, our rainfall really isn't changing that much, but it's sure changing in terms of when we get it. And it's changing in terms of what comes as snowfall versus rain. And again, the tool we point to most is just a healthy soil structure.
I have a quick question for you, Dan.
Sure.
How do you protect those perennial plants? If that's one of the most important ways to keep the rangeland health, how do you protect those?
It mostly revolves around that 1 year when there aren't livestock there. So without taking a lot of time, I mean, these perennial plants evolved with grazing. And so removing that material and then giving that plant an opportunity to fully recover. So that plant, and I won't say that we get everything perfect, but in an ideal situation, that plant would be fully recovered, replaced all of its root reserves, replaced the above ground solar panels, which are leaves, before we grazed it again. And then that plant, we would come in with livestock, we would graze that plant. The plant would say, thanks, because we're removing the material that allows solar, the sun to reach those growth points and grow more forage. It's a little more complex, but I would say the key piece there is giving adequate rest and recovery so that plant is fully recovered.
Thank you. Hannah Gosnell, professor of geography from OSU, is our one panelist who doesn't live here, but she's been here a lot. And in her bio, she says she's particularly interested in social, cultural, and psychological aspects of the transition to regenerative agriculture. And so, Hannah, I was wondering if you could give us sort of a broader perspective of what's going on in the West and what you've learned about the social, cultural, and psychological aspects of drier conditions and how regenerative agriculture can possibly conserve water and our farming way of life.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks, Katie, for inviting me. Good to be here. I've been a fan of Fishtrap from afar for a long time, ever since I heard about it. So it's an honor to be part of this, and hope to get there in person sometime. Just a little bit more about me. I'm, as Katie said, a professor of geography in the College of Earth, Ocean, and Atmospheric Sciences at Oregon State. I'm a social scientist. Most of my research has to do with the human dimensions of natural resource management, and especially around the human dimensions of rangeland management. I've been studying ranchers and trying to understand how and why they do what they do for quite some time. And one big part of my research over the past decade or so has focused on understanding, as you said, how and why ranchers and farmers transition from conventional to regenerative, climate smart agriculture. And I've been doing research on that topic in the US West and also in Australia. And as a social scientist, I come at it from the psychological, the social, the cultural, political aspects, mostly the constraints and enablers that make it possible to transition. Really, it's nice that Dan went right before me, because he's sort of the example of the kind of farmer or rancher that I was trying to understand when I went to Australia several years ago for my sabbatical, to focus on who are these carbon farmers. They go by different names: regenerative ranchers, holistic managers, there's holistic planned grazing, adaptive multi-paddock grazing, managed grazing. And what's interesting about this approach to grazing that Dan talks about is that not only does it enhance adaptive capacity and increase resilience to drought, but also has the potential to enhance soil carbon sequestration, which contributes to climate change mitigation. So I think that's what's so exciting about this way of grazing that Dan is talking about, is that it has this sort of synergistic ability to both promote climate change adaptation and mitigation. And so because we're seeing so much more drought across the West, I think more and more ranchers are becoming interested in this way of doing things. And it's sort of hit or miss whether there's training available. Some NRCS offices are interested in promoting regenerative ranching and holistic planned grazing, others not so much. So it kind of depends on where you are in the West as to whether you have access to learning about this approach. Because Dan probably glossed over it a little bit, but it's, it takes quite a bit of training and experimentation and learning to really get good at ranching the way he's talking about, that you have to know when exactly to move the cattle, how many cattle to have, when to destock, when to stock, and really trying to stay ahead of, being very proactive, staying ahead of the weather. The tools that Kyle is talking about are certainly helpful for anticipating what's going to come, but key to being a really resilient rancher is sort of just always preparing for the worst, assuming that things might not turn out the way you plan, always leaving a buffer. And so it's just a whole different way of thinking. And so I've sort of, some of my research is focused on understanding how people change the way they think. Ranchers change the way they think. They sort of shift to systems thinking. And they also have to learn a whole new set of skills around moving the cattle, low stress livestock handling, new approaches to monitoring. So there are a lot of constraints, but there's also some really exciting enablers. The fact that once people do transition, they often find that it's not only helping them with their resilience to drought, but oftentimes, increases biodiversity above and below ground, increases wildlife habitat. It's increasingly enabling them to access certain niche markets. So there's starting to be more opportunities to get paid for ecosystem services associated with soil carbon, or sometimes even just eco-labeling. I know Country Natural Beef likes to promote the fact that their ranchers are managing in carbon-friendly ways. So there's also the, oftentimes people will give up their use of chemicals because they realize that the chemicals are very expensive. The synthetic fertilizers, the pesticides, herbicides are very expensive and are kind of counter to trying to grow these deep-rooted native perennials that Dan was talking about. And so by giving up the chemicals, that increases their bottom line. So economically, it's often beneficial to transition to regenerative. And then just, often because they're having to learn the system and learn how nature works and work with nature and leverage these natural processes, there's a kind of an excitement and a satisfaction that comes from understanding nature and working with nature versus kind of trying to fight it with the chemicals. So that's just kind of like a brief overview of some of the findings. For me, it's a really exciting trend that's occurring across the West. More and more ranchers becoming interested in this, becoming more and more mainstream. People like Gabe Brown popularizing regenerative ranching, writing books about it, being interviewed in the mainstream. But what's important to know is that it's not a simple thing to transition ranch the way Dan's talking about, and I see Corey Carmen's on the call too, another example of holistic planned grazing. It's quite a sophisticated method, and it requires a lot of training, a lot of support, a lot of peer-to-peer learning networks. It requires, it would benefit from financial support from government agencies like NRCS. It could benefit from a carbon market. But yeah, I think a big question is how to facilitate a broader transition to this kind of range management so that people are more resilient to drought and are also helping mitigate climate change. Ranchers can help mitigate climate change, which is contrary to what a lot of people think about ranchers. They often just think of ranchers as the problem contributing to climate change, but it's not the cow, it's the how, as they say. So it's important to understand, okay, well, how can we support ranchers to ranch in ways that are going to help all of us?
I've got a question for a couple other panelists. One just came up with for Hannah, and we're going to go to that question next. And that is there any relationship between permaculture ideas and the adaptive patterns you describe?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot of overlap between permaculture and holistic management and regenerative agriculture. And most people who are managing this way will tell you that they draw on lots of different philosophies, agroforestry, biodynamics sometimes. So yeah, permaculture is really a powerful approach to land management, super exciting. And it's also kind of a systems way of thinking about the landscape. And that's what characterizes holistic planned grazing.
And I want to pivot over to Joe Dawson, who uses cover cropping and probably some other ways of conserving water, improving soil, because it's not just about switching from flood irrigation to pivots in water conservation. I know some of the things that he does in irrigated cropland are also conserving water and improving soil. So Joe, could you tell us a little bit about those methods?
Yeah, we started cover cropping. A lot of farmers did in the area. We were kind of pushed a little bit by, it was one of the NRCS agents, and we were kind of inspired by the Gabe Brown story. And I think a lot of the experimenting in Wallowa County was just seeing what plants actually grew up here, because what worked for Gabe Brown in the Midwest doesn't necessarily work up here with high elevation. And we had a lot of different farming styles that were into it. I mean, so like the Melville family, who's religiously no-till, we're starting to incorporate it into their annual crops, for their wheat and their peas. And then you also had kind of more people that were kind of semi-conventional, like the Butterfield family, and they were starting to incorporate it into their hay rotations. And I thought that was kind of a neat tool for the hay rotations is, they would start out with alfalfa, then they would go directly no-till in Timothy, and then they would finish with cover cropping the Timothy to kind of, it just as a tool to kind of break up sod. And one of the benefits of that is they don't till maybe once every 10 years. So you're not having a lot of that soil issues that you have with tillage, and you're also having a little bit better organic material to have. Anyway, we've seen a lot of benefits with that as far as just water conservation. It retains water a lot better in the soil, and it's kind of been a fun way to incorporate in cattle into your conventional farming. So it's been fun to watch. And again, we're still learning. I mean, a lot of it is just seeing what works well up here. And, we're starting to get a little bit of a pattern of what's working up here, but we still like to try new things when we can. Hope that's a good enough answer for you on that.
Thanks, Joe. I love writing stories about these things. So I will try and keep my questions down to a dull roar. We're going to go back to forestry for a moment. And Joseph Goebel, as long as you're still able to communicate, I know you signed back on with your phone, so hopefully that'll work a little better for you. So the question for Joseph is, do you think that chipping and masticating, mulching are a realistic and potentially measurable alternative to piling and burning for disposing excess fuels with respect to smoke production? And I'll let you answer that and before I ask you the second question.
Yeah, no problem. So the questions here that Michael asked, anytime you get into talking about masticating and chipping, dealing with utilizing those fuels in different ways rather than just piling and burning, it's a little tricky because it depends on the situation. What I mean by that is it can depend on the location of the material that we're talking about, and it can depend on the scale, and the impacts, the factors, not the impacts, but the factors that really come into play are how is that material going to be utilized? So as an alternative, sometimes I would say sometimes, yes, sometimes it might be an alternative. In our area, we live in such a rural area that so much of the forest landscape that we're trying to manage, it's not close to our population centers. So what you'll see sometimes, I'll give maybe a couple different scenarios to kind of help give folks an idea of like when it might be an alternative and when it is not. If you're really focused on trying to reduce wildfire severity, then we're really encouraging folks to think about trying to reduce those fuel loads as often as possible. And so piling and burning, you can obviously do roughly, let's say, 8 or 9 months of the year. So that really means that if you want to continue to actively reduce fuels during fire season when you can't be burning, chipping and composting those fuels somewhere is obviously a reasonable alternative on a small scale, right? For a homeowner with a small chipper, that's definitely a potential alternative. And especially in that case, because you're talking about homeowners who tend to live next to neighbors. And so you're reducing the amount of smoke you're putting into the valley. To your point, Katy, we live where that smoke, if you have too many piles going, we can smoke out our neighbors and our communities. So in that case, it's also a good thing. On the larger landscape scale for us, it's difficult because we've got industrial timberlands. And so if you go out and you reduce, you're trying to do forest cleanup behind, say, a timber harvest, you're essentially having to ask yourself, are you achieving your objectives by chipping that material out there, or can you utilize it in some way? Oftentimes for us, it's not an economically viable deal. And so that's one of the barriers to overcome oftentimes is just the economics. One of the ways that people have started to try to overcome that is kind of through agroforestry with creating biochar. So for us, again, it's not really, biochar is an example of a way to overcome this situation in other areas. And what I mean by that is Southeast United States might be a good example. You've got a lot of flatland forest landscape, and you can have farm fields right across the road, or you might have farm crops mixed in with your trees. And so if you create that biochar on site, you're essentially not into it for any additional money. And actually to the next question, I think you're going to talk about it as far as a carbon footprint, you're not having to burn diesel or fuel to move that biochar on site to help. So that makes it maybe a reasonable alternative. For us, if you chip that material out on the ground, it's so far from the infrastructure or anywhere that it would be utilized that it doesn't make economic or ecological sense to transport it from that site to where it can be used. That's also not the case, say, in Central Oregon. I have seen it used very often where if you essentially do a fuels reduction project on a large enough scale, it can be successful. So at least up to about 10 years ago, the scale that was required was, say, maybe 40 acres. You couldn't really do this for anything less than 40 acres. They can essentially chip. Different manufacturers were working to create different machinery to help. They would even bale the fuels out in the forest landscape. But in Central Oregon, you have populations with the infrastructure to remove those fuels from the forest landscape and utilize them in some other way. And so those are alternatives, but typically it's harder. It's not impossible, but it's more difficult for us just given how far our population centers are from so much of our forest landscape.
And is it okay to leave some of those chips to turn back into humus and soil? And if it's not a fire hazard, Joseph?
Yes. You know, the chipping. So I always feel like the chips on the ground are it would be an unusual situation where it's an additional fire hazard because those chips tend to be so compact that it would never really add to the severity or spread of a wildfire. I think the more important question that I always try to encourage folks to think about as a landowner is, again, back to the soil health, actually. If it's a small amount of fuels work going on and it's just a few chips, it's usually a good thing. I have seen forestry units where the chips are so thick, you know, that it's essentially carbon, right? It's all carbon. And you don't want just pure carbon going back into your soils. It's the carbon to nitrogen ratio that tends to be more important. And so if I was ever in that situation where you're talking about a large landscape scale project and you're going to have a large amount of that going in, I would talk with a soils expert and get an opinion about, is it too much? And if it is too much, that still doesn't mean that you can't do it, but it probably means you have to do an additional practice to help with some nitrogen fixation. That would be, I think, the option in that case.
One quick question, Joseph, can you please give a definition of what biochar is?
I can try. I'm definitely not an expert on biochar. Biochar is essentially they've created a machine and they essentially burn woody material down to it's not ash, right? By the time you burn woody material to ash, my understanding is that the nutritional value going into the soil has already, you've burnt it away. And so they burn it at a low temp and they take that material off right before it turns to ash. And that allows the nutrients from that woody material to be more accessible to the soil. So that's probably about as close as I understand it. Somebody on here like Dan may even have a better understanding of biochar than I do.
Thanks, Joseph. And I was going to look at our farmers and ranchers to ask this question. Is anyone using biochar? Joe Dawson, do you know anybody who's using it either in the county or regionally to improve soil health? There was a demonstration about 2 years ago down at the Tamcolex Powwow grounds of a biochar machine. It's pretty cool. And as we keep talking, I realize how much technology is helping and or driving some of these things. So Joe Dawson, what do you know about biochar and its ability to help soil health in our region?
Only very little. I know Wallowa Resources, we did a few really just test plots on irrigated cropland of biochar, of kind of instilling it. And again, it was just to see if like water retention would increase. Because I think they were starting to experiment with it quite a bit, if I remember correctly, on dryland farms. And I think that might be a place where it can have a lot of utility as area that does not have control over the water is, you know, because if it can help increase the water retention in the soil, I think was the idea. And I posted an article for the USDA that kind of gives you somewhat of a definition of biochar, because I'm certainly not an expert on it, but we've kind of just been slowly experimenting with it. But again, it's we're learning as best as I can describe it.
Dan Probert, are you familiar with any uses? I know you're not a dryland farmer, but you don't irrigate where your cattle are grazing. Do you know anything about biochar helping rangeland?
Yeah, and Joe and any other farmer on here would attest that I'm not a farmer. So so the only thing that we're investigating with biochar is possibly as a supplement to actually feed to cattle to mitigate greenhouse gas emissions, essentially methane. And biochar is not approved as a feed supplement, so there may be some opportunities with trial work, but essentially methane is a result of cattle or livestock breaking down cellulose. I mean, that's what they're good at, right? Is taking a source of roughage and turning it into a human grade protein. But in that process, then there's methane that's emitted. There's some, and it's very early. Maybe there's some opportunity with biochar in that way. But I think what Joseph said, to put biochar directly on soil on rangelands, I mean, just would not be financially viable.
It is a cool thing to write about, like regenerative agriculture, but it's does seem to still be in the early phases of seeing how well it works. I want to talk a little bit more about technology because it keeps coming up. Kyle Hogrefe's work is very tech-based, and I wonder, and I know you went over it a little bit, Kyle, but if you could just explain a little bit about how ranchers can, go to a website, or you put out emails regularly. How is technology driving the work that you're doing and helping our ranchers?
Yeah, thanks for the opportunity there, Katie. I was holding my tongue there, hoping for another chance to speak, to talk about just this. And in doing so, I think I wanted to try to pull a little bit together a little bit of what Dan and Hannah were talking about. And in doing so, I want to take a step back. I mentioned the two computer models that I used. That one's called FigroLuz, and it uses a lot of actual range survey data that we go out and physically collect to make biomass estimates. And the other approach uses satellite imagery to directly estimate biomass in rangelands. Anywhere there's not trees, you can estimate how much grass biomass is there just from the satellite signal. And using those two technologies, we've created what's called the Wallowa County LUZ, the Wallowa County Livestock Early Warning System. And if you look in the chat, I just posted a link there that would take you directly to the Wallowa County Livestock Early Warning System. You can see a little bit of the data that's available there. I would also point out that the Livestock Early Warning System is the first tool that was created by a community-based group that we put together to create rangelands management information. And we're calling that the Wallowa County Rangeland Assessment and Monitoring System, the WC RAMS. And if you, I know a lot of you are on the email list to get some of the a bi-weekly update to the link with these forage forecasts. If you're not on it, I'd be happy to add you. Now, I bring all that up because the WC LUZ is our first product that meets one of the WC RAMs, excuse all the acronyms, goals of creating information products that ranchers or other rangeland managers can use to inform their decisions. and as I was alluding to before, we hope that these forage forecasts can help with stock management decisions. And also we hope the information can kind of help, say, with drought insurance claims and that kind of thing. One of the other aims of the WCRAMs is actually to conduct local research that informs upscale management decisions and can influence things in, say, the way the U.S. Forest Services manages their allotments. I believe Dan has the advantage of most of the lands, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, Dan, please, most of the lands that he uses to run his cattle are his private lands or lands that he operates with TNC. And he kind of has maximum flexibility with what he's able to do with his livestock. I know a lot of ranchers across the county rely a lot on public lands, which are all managed by Forest Service around here in their allotment system. And a lot of the regulations that are part of that allotment program are a little more strict than Dan has to deal with. So some of these innovative ideas, it's actually hard for ranchers to do on public lands. Well, it's nice that within our Wallowa County RAMs, the Range and Assessment Monitoring System, the TNC is involved, the U.S. Forest Service is involved, in addition to a suite of ranchers through a group that put together ICAPS, the International Center for the Advancement of Pastoral Systems, led by Dennis Sheehy. I think some of you are familiar with his work. But anyway, point being, with U.S. Forest Service at the table during June and July, during last year's drought, there was a lot of conversation about how the U.S. Forest Service allotment system could be, number one, loosened up to allow some of the more innovative livestock management that Dan was talking about, but also could some of the allotments that are, say, down in Hell's Canyon that are currently declared vacant due to endangered species concerns, could some of those actually be managed as a grass bank for emergency forage in times of drought? And both of those questions lead to more questions from the U.S. Forest Service about the types of information that are needed for the agency to be able to loosen their regulations up to allow for the more flexible things and what they, for the more flexible management and for opening areas as grass banks. Excuse me. And what, to bring this around, what the request is from the Forest Service is to identify the research that's needed to loosen up the grazing regs for both of those reasons, for some more innovative grazing styles and to use some of the closed areas as grass banks. What information does the U.S. Forest Service need so that we can then be proactive, identify that information, and then next time a drought hits, we have a system set up that, number one, ranchers are using those more resilient methods so that the landscape is better prepared for drought, but also that there's the agency structure. And so some of the barriers to using the more innovative grazing methods that Hannah was talking about, some of those are knocked down just through the provision of information from us as the CB-RAMs, as a local source that feeds that upscale, feeds it up to the upper levels of the system that basically allow local land managers more authority and more power with how they manage the land and the livestock. Hope I kept that coherent. Thank you for the time there.
Thanks, Kyle. I want to ask Hannah, again, going to the bigger picture, what sort of technology is used in your department or in your research that sort of helps us either forecast drought conditions or helps people become more resilient to the future of drought?
Well, Kyle is exhibit A for that. He's a geographer, prospective PhD student, and has done a great job of taking this issue of climate smart ranching, climate smart agriculture. We were funded by the USDA Pacific Northwest, Northwest Climate Hub several years ago. Northwest Climate Hub said, we want people to do research on how to support ranchers to adapt to climate change. We applied for a grant. We said, I'll do the social science part. Kyle's going to develop a decision support tool to help ranchers with their, to help them adapt to drought and to be more resilient to climate change. And so that's what he just told you about, is this project he's been working on for several years to support ranchers with a decision support tool. And as a social scientist, my bread and butter is qualitative research. So I am not the person to ask about technology and tools. I recruit grad students like Kyle to do that sort of thing. And I think what's really powerful is when you bring the social science, the qualitative research together with the tools and the technology, because you really need to look at rangelands as a social ecological system. And there's, you need to know the ecological aspects and the technological aspects, but without understanding the social and cultural and political aspects of the system, the tools only go so far. So I'm a big proponent of the geographic synthetic approach to understanding rangelands as social ecological systems. So yeah, I don't have a great answer for like the latest technology or tools.
Well, you receive funding and you have people like Kyle and other students plug that in. So that's a great answer, actually. And also, your focus on social science is something that Wallowa County government is always inserting in every aspect of the science that we weigh in on, or write a letter, or conduct a natural resource advisory committee meeting with a presenter. And that question came up in the Northern Blues Forest Collaborative meeting last Wednesday, where we had someone from the hub give a presentation on climate change in the coming 80 years. And Commissioner Susan Roberts brought that up one more time. What's the social economic impact of drought? And so particular to this panel, Hannah, from a social science perspective, can you give us any sort of insight on how people feel about traveling and visiting areas that may be impacted by smoke, and how that can be sort of a negative for local economies?
Yeah, I haven't thought too much about that, the recreation and tourism aspects of drought. There's probably been a number of studies. There have been a number of studies. The fire social scientists, there's a number of them that are quite prominent in the West. A lot of them are at Colorado State University, people like Tony Chang, and people that have done a lot of research on fire and forests and smoke and the social science aspects, how it's impacting communities. Yeah, I think, where was I just reading something that, I don't know if it was a blog or an article or something. I think it was in the New York Times, actually. It was a Sunday New York Times Magazine article about California and fire and drought. And just the author was just reflecting on whether they could enjoy their old Sierra, their favorite Sierra places with smoke, going to like your favorite Sierra lake. And it's shrouded in smoke, and is it really, can you still really enjoy it? And she kind of came to the conclusion that no, it definitely was not as good. So I don't know if it's going to mean that people will stop going to their favorite places to Wallowa Lake, in the summer and certain times of year. I mean, personally, I know I've been canceling my backpack trips because of fire and smoke, and looking for better places. I went backpacking in the North Cascades for the first time a couple summers ago because I was going to go to the Sierras and they were full of smoke. So people will adapt and they'll find places that have less smoke or no smoke. So I think it could be a huge impact on the local tourist economy. And yeah, I'm not really well equipped to talk about the specifics of the impacts, but I can tell you who to talk to and connect you with some of those fire social scientists.
So from a local perspective, our smoke tends to have its biggest impact, it seems, in August, sometimes late July. I know when I planned my wedding in 2019, I planned it for early July, so it wouldn't be smoked out. And I always feel a little heartbroken for those brides who are married in a bunch of smoke and you can't get that photo of Chief Joseph Mountain behind you or the lake. There is some technology that may influence tourism. And I want to go back to Joseph Goebel to talk a little bit about this. And he's probably like, what are you talking about? Well, air.gov has probably gotten more use in the last few years than a lot of websites. Air.gov can tell you how bad the air is. And a lot of people are starting to get kind of comfortable using some of the verbiage used. It's a purple air day. And another thing, Joseph, that you guys use, I know, is Avenza. And correct me, I think there's some other technology, but ODF and the Forest Service have a way of tracking fires. So the tricky thing about fire suppression is if you get on it and you put it out, there's a lot less smoke. And if you let it burn for ecological benefit, then there's more smoke. So managers have to balance these things. So one of my favorite tools is a smoke meter, which has a funny name. And we have one here in Enterprise up at the old Forest Service compound above, next to the Best Western or the Eagles View Hotel. So Joseph, how does ODF work with DEQ on air quality? Because that messaging can affect us and whether someone's going to come here for the weekend.
Yep. So on the bigger picture, specifically to your question about working with DEQ, I think we are pulling on my memory strings. I think we're about 2 years in. The smoke management regulations were looked at and adjusted, I believe 2 years ago. So one of the main things they were looking at, you mentioned the meter in Enterprise. There are meters that look at that air quality in all of our air sheds. The Grand Ronde Valley is actually a really great Northeast Oregon example to think about because they have such problems in dealing with burning out in the forest landscape, just given that almost no matter where you're going to burn around the Grand Ronde Valley, it's really difficult to not have airflow that's going to pull that smoke down into the valley somewhere at some point. And so it's very difficult sometimes for them, more difficult than us even, to find air quality days with the right weather conditions to burn. And so when you're looking at those sites, those regulations that have been agreed to develop, they're basically based around what we call intrusions. And so you look at air quality in a short term, for an hour or two. And then you can also look at the air quality as it runs over like a longer term period, right? 24 or 48 hours. And I think that was looked at because there's recognition, even from like somebody like DEQ, they don't want to have impacts to the population from smoke, but they realize that the negative impacts are typically if the smoke is at a particular level, say a high level over the course of days, and they've changed those regulations to help allow for a broader definition or an easier time frame of what we consider to be an intrusion. And what I mean by that is if you have somebody who goes out and wants to remove some fuels and they're going to burn, it's a little easier to find a window, and that smoke may be allowed into that air shed for as long as it's going to be a short duration. And I'm not sure I could tell you what those durations are right now off the top of my head. But essentially, if you can do that work and get the smoke out there and then have it dispersed within a couple of hours, that's accepted to be more beneficial compared to what they don't want to have. Is they don't want to have you conducting a burn where that smoke is going to smolder and hang in that air shed, and people are going to have to deal with it day after day after day. So on top of that, the other way that ODF works with them is ODF has basically our smoke management office, which is out of Salem, and by regulation, I get a smoke management forecast any day. So any local landowner who's going to conduct a burn, they can always get that information from us, and we can plan to help them conduct those operations on days that are going to lessen the impact. And we can compare the air quality and say, okay, the size of what you're going to do, it meets what we're saying is okay to do. You should be fine and go forth, or no, like you need to limit how much you're going to do. Even the Forest Service, they register directly with that office. And so they've got a direct communication link. If they're going to conduct a large prescribed fire burn, whether that's broadcast or piles, that smoke management office is monitoring what the conditions are on a day-to-day basis. And for the most part, it's fairly easy here in Northeast Oregon. There are quite a few days typically for our work to occur. Folks have to really be careful with when they burn when you're in places like Southwest Oregon. You have far fewer burn days. There's more population. Again, it's very similar to the Grand Ronde Valley. A lot of that Willamette Valley, your forest lands are sitting above your population centers. It's very easy to conduct some type of burn operation that will put smoke down into areas, and those sensors will show that the air quality, you'll have an intrusion and you will cause health problems. So they really have to work hard to avoid those kind of issues.
Thanks, Joseph. Nephelometer, is that what it's called?
That is the meter. Yep.
I was scratching my head about that one. I love that word. What I enjoy about conversations and natural resources is bringing together the social economic with the data. The data is showing in the last couple of years that Wallowa County is extremely popular as far as recreation. There are guesses between 750,000 to 1 million people come to visit us every year. Wallowa Lake State Park has had record numbers in 2020 and 2021. A lot of Forest Service campgrounds, not in our county, but elsewhere where they have more recreational impact, you have to reserve your site. And those reservations open up about 6 months or so before you can go and camp there. National parks, forget about camping in a national park if you don't have a reservation. And the Forest Service campgrounds are getting to be the same way. Those recreational impacts are good economically. Our county was very resilient in the summers of 2020 and 2021, where people weren't flying. They were going on shorter vacations to beautiful areas with fewer people. So focused a lot on air quality because of who we have in the room. Most of my Forest Service contacts were not able to come today because they were going to be at Ferguson Ridge skiing. Obviously, drought is going to impact that industry, that recreational opportunity. When in future decades we receive more rain than we do snow. So that's going to be kind of a bummer. Now, we don't really attract a lot of skiers, but there's mostly backcountry skiers. If you ever go up to Salt Creek, those parking lots can be very busy with a lot of out-of-state plates to enjoy Wing Ridge skiing and go out into the huts. So I think it's to be determined how that's going to impact our winter recreation and tourism. And as far as some other areas besides air quality, drought is going to affect our ability to fish. I don't think Chinook salmon fishing has been available as a recreational opportunity in the county unless you go to the Snake River, but on the Imnaha and the Wallowa, it's been very, very limited. And our steelhead fishing, which the county is well known for, we haven't had to shorten or close seasons, but the fishing hasn't been really awesome for a while. The increase of risk of forest fires often will close trails, and that will reduce our ability to invite tourists into the county. So in those respects, we don't have the data to show that recreation is decreasing in the county. It's only increasing at this point. However, Mother Nature will do as she will, and we'll just have to see, if there are great cancellations in August at the camp, because it's not just about the scenery, it's about our health. One of the things that Joseph touched on was their smoke management office in Salem. We got a competitive grant as the county a couple years ago to do some study into smoke management and the impact on the population. We just received another grant to work on what we call the implementation, which is going to mean a lot of communication, whether it's short videos, increased web presence, Facebook, social media, and just getting information out to people about the hazards of smoke, how they can protect themselves through air filters, stay inside, wear a mask, reduce athletic and recreational activities during high smoke impacts to protect people from their health. Another thing that Joseph is very involved with, as well as our Forest Service partners, is something called the Community Wildfire Protection Plan. And this is getting away from tourism, but back to quality of life. And there's also a program called Firewise. And what the Community Wildfire Protection Plan does is sort of identify neighborhoods and houses in what we call the wildland urban interface, where your house is going to be at higher risk than, say, mine in the middle of Enterprise from a potential wildfire. And wildfires are going to increase in severity and acreage and occurrence as we get drier. So ODF, the Forest Service, Wallowa Resources, some other organizations are working with landowners, teaching them about don't have mulch right up against your house, clear those needles out of your gutters, thin and remove trees close to the house to protect your property. And it'll also protect life. Safety is a big deal, whether it's with our tourists or local people. When we talk about getting in the woods, how do we get them back out? How do we get people from the south end of Wallowa Lake to safety if a fire comes down Chief Joseph Mountain? How do we get people out of the Lostine when we've counted literally hundreds of cars parked near the Tupan Trailhead, which is at the end of the Lostine Road, for those of you who aren't in the county. Very, very popular place to get into the backcountry. So smoke impacts our view, our health, and forest fires impact our safety, our livelihoods, and our general enjoyment of living here in the remote part of northeastern Oregon. So we have a few minutes left. Are there any other questions for our panelists? I want to thank Mike for asking me if I could give him some ideas on this. And as will happen when you volunteer, suddenly you're sucked in and moderating a panel for the first time. I'm used to communicating more with my keyboard than verbally. So thank you for this opportunity. I really enjoyed sort of fielding these questions, and all of them are super pertinent to what we're doing here. And I love the fact that clear thinking and writing in the West are the focus of Fishtrap. As a writer, it keeps me excited because that's what I do. I write about Western issues, particularly natural resources. And then I get to work with all these same people in my county job. And I appreciate all of you giving up a beautiful Saturday morning to have this conversation. And I hope some of you will have an opportunity to get outside and enjoy the day.
Thank you, Katy. This was fantastic. And thank all of you for, as Katie just said, for just participating in Winter Fish Trap in this conversation. All of you panelists, Hannah, Dan, Joseph, Kyle, and Joe, you folks think about this stuff all the time, but for a layperson like me, all of it is just so informative, and to be able to have a chance to pull folks like you together for a conversation really is informative. If you missed any part of this or you'd like to watch it again, we will put up a video just for you folks sometime next week. I have to process this a little bit, but I'll send you all a link to that. And if you have any questions or want to connect with any of these panelists, I can help do that too, starting next week. And I just want to, if anybody wants to hang around afterwards and chat a little bit, we'll stick around for a while. But otherwise, I really hope you have a wonderful weekend. Thanks for being a part of Winter Fish Trap. Summer Fish Trap registration opens February 1st at 9 a.m. Pacific time. Right there in that sweet spot, Katie, that you were talking about just before the fires, just before the smoke comes, right? It takes place July 11 through 17, 2022. So until then, thank you, everybody. Have a great day.